Hi class, so today I want to link what we've been talking about in terms of the performances of identity through documentary modes, to link that to practices of surveillance. Because as I mentioned in the last lecture, since digital media encourage sharing, one of the outcomes of that is that we are sharing broadly, putting a lot of ourselves online, performing the self online for each other, and the result being that we're watching each other all the time. We are engaging in surveillance of each other. We're actually monitoring each other in some ways. So I want to link that practice to the larger history of surveillance and to think about how identity and surveillance have gone hand in hand throughout history. So the history of surveillance really began with modes of contagion and disease in certain cultures where people had to be quarantined. They had to be put into their house and they were monitored in a sense. So the powerful were watching those who were ill to make sure they didn't necessarily leave their house and spread the disease into the community. So surveillance was a practice that was the powerful monitoring certain individuals for, in this instance, the protection of the community. It was a policing to look out for the health of the broader community. And subsequently, there has been this very dominant notion that the powerful engage in surveillance of the disempowered. It's typically been a top-down model, which is actually this idea of surveillance from above, is actually part of the French term that we get the word from. So it's historically been a top-down mode of watching, of visibility, of surveilling, of monitoring. And this led to an idea called the panopticon, which was this architecture of a prison system in the 1700s that ultimately has led to the modeling of various prisons throughout the world, where there's a core to it. And the core is a place where the people in power, the guards, watch the people who are imprisoned in this location. The interesting thing about the panopticon was that it was never verifiable whether you were actually being watched. You just had the feeling that you were being watched the whole time. You couldn't actually see the guard. The guard could see you, but you couldn't see the guard. And the idea of the panopticon was discipline would come and prisoners would reform themselves because they would feel being watched. And when you think you're being watched, you behave differently, is the idea. And Michel Foucault has written about this when he talks about disciplinary societies, that often when we feel we're being watched, we change our behavior. And the powerful implement this in as many ways as possible. Get people to feel that they're being monitored and they will become good citizens, in quotes. That they will be disciplined into being ideal citizens whose behavior fits the model of the cultural norms of the time. So this is an interesting foundation for what we are now experiencing with social media. Does social media actually cause us to act the same? When we think about the performances of identity, are you being disciplined into certain social norms because you feel you're being watched by people? This is an interesting question for social media. When we're watching each other, what is the ultimate effect on our behavior of the feeling of being watched? Subsequently, after this long history of top-down surveillance, there was a movement of reverse surveillance. And part of this was the technologies in the hands of everyday citizens to monitor the powerful. And one of the most famous incidents of this is the filming of the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles in the 1990s, where an everyday citizen had a camcorder and was on the spot to see Rodney King being abused by Los Angeles police, and filmed this, and it was released to news organizations at the time. It was the disempowered monitoring the powerful. It was a reverse surveillance. When I was at UCLA doing my graduate work, one of the things that happened there was a student was trying to be detained by the security guards on campus, and they tased him. And there were many students around watching it, and many of them were actually filming it with their cell phones as well. So this again is an interesting shift. When video technologies are in the hands of everyday people, what's the effects on surveillance? Now those who are in power can be filmed by the everyday citizen who has a cell phone in their pocket to monitor what's happening around them. We have cameras everywhere. They are ubiquitous. And now the effects can be, the powerful can be surveilled by the disempowered or the everyday citizen. What's happening more so than even reverse surveillance is what Al Brexlin calls in his article participatory surveillance, where essentially we're watching each other and that we're engaging in a mode of exchange of all of our data, including photographs, status updates, and location, and ultimately sharing that with each other in this expectation of participatory surveillance. And this is sometimes called lateral surveillance and sousveillance, or other terms that signify a shift in the hierarchy, and more so thinking about it in lateral terms about us watching each other. So one of the things that is interesting about this is how ultimately when we see ourselves being watched, we perform for that. And when I use the term performance of identity, I don't mean that this kind of performance is false. I would actually argue that all identity is performed, that we actually perform ourselves on a daily basis, and it's not a false sense like you're acting, like putting on a false character. That ultimately, when we think about how our identity gets practiced in daily life, it actually gets performed, it gets enacted. And that's more what I mean by performances of identity, how it gets enacted in everyday life. And it differs based on the context, right? Based on who you're interacting with. Your identity gets performed differently for parents than it does for close peers, than it does for professors. You perform differently in each of those settings, but ultimately none of those performances are necessarily false. They are just different modes of yourself being expressed in different contexts. With social media, we have what's called context collapse, where ultimately how you perform can't be tailored to each of those audiences, because on Facebook you have your parents, your professors, your friends, your high school acquaintances, elementary school people. You have a range of people all looking at your photograph. And you can't tailor it for those particular audiences because it gets public. You can go in and perhaps change privacy settings so certain people see certain things and others don't. But for the most part, the default setting is that your social network all sees what you're posting. They all see the documents that you're engaging. And so it makes it difficult to tailor your performance of identity, because you don't know who's necessarily watching it. Going back to a previous lecture where we talked about invisible audiences, part of that is we have a broad audience for our social networks, and we often can't tailor the performance of identity for those particular groups. So we have a context collapse. The thing I'd like to end with here today is to think about the effects of watching each other. First of all, why do we do it? Why do you put your life online? And I'm interested to hear your responses to this. What causes you and motivates you to put parts of your life out there for people to watch, to surveil? Is it motivated out of performance of identity, as one sense that you know yourself better because you're able to perform that identity and test it out in an online space, for example? This is one legitimate avenue for understanding participatory surveillance, is that when you see yourself on the screen, when you see yourself being watched, that helps you understand how your performance is being read by the world, and it helps you fit your identity and performance of identity to who you want to be. The other aspect that could fit with this is the idea of reciprocity, that people are putting their lives online, and for you to participate, you feel the need to give back. That engaging in the social community that exists online requires a back and forth, a reciprocity. You're putting yourself online because people are putting themselves online. And do you feel motivated by reciprocity? I think this is an interesting question. In order to feel like an embodied participant, an active and engaged person in these spaces, do you feel the need to put yourself online as well? So thinking about the disciplinary effects of participatory surveillance and ultimately the reasons for putting our lives online, putting all of these documents of ourselves out into the sphere into the public sphere for people to watch, and what motivates us to do that are questions I'd like to hear answers from you about these things, because to me it's a fascinating dynamic that we're currently living in, that surveillance has changed dramatically in this moment, and we are putting a lot of ourselves out there for others to watch. So I'm interested to hear your comments about this, and look forward to talking to you online about it.